Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started if everybody wants to find their seats. All right. Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to all of those that have joined us for the afternoon session. Before lunch, we focused on curatorial and critical method, on how artistic practices like Nnena Kalu's are encountered, interpreted, and held within exhibitions, institution, in the media. But we looked at how being fluid, expansive, and unfixed in our approaches can operate as a method in itself, or at least I suppose we looked at that potential. So if that first conversation looked at how the work is activated, this panel asked something slightly different. What makes that activation possible and sustainable? And how can supported studio structures be better recognized, not only as a resource for artists, but for curators, galleries, and museums as well? And crucially, how advocacy, both visible and behind the scenes, plays a role in sustaining that recognition over time. So to recenter the stakes, Nnena's Turner Prize nomination win has brought to the forefront the incredible progress made, but it also highlights the need to ensure ongoing visibility and sustainability for practices from supported studios. Because that moment of visibility, this watershed moment that we all keep speaking of, it didn't appear suddenly. With ActionSpace, it sits within decades of facilitation, organizational labor, advocacy, and coalition. And the sustained commitment of advocates working across studios, institutions, and networks to hold that visibility in place. So this afternoon, we're interested in those conditions. We're thinking about how to better understand, position, and recognize supported studio structures as key cultural intermediaries, and how their role as advocates, not just facilitators, might be more clearly articulated within the field. We might also think about what becomes possible if we recognize these studio structures as forms of coalitional thinking, how these might further shape the field going forward. So part of what we're asking today is, what has to be in place structurally, ethically, and relationally for artistic practices within supported studios to circulate as contemporary art without being flattened, instrumentalized, or overexposed? And just to return to some of the overarching descriptions that we've been talking about, just to help with understanding, earlier today, I spoke of cultural intermediaries, the people and structures that shape how artistic work becomes public, legible, and valued. For this panel, I want to turn that lens towards the supported studios themselves and their coalitional relationships. And there are many studio representatives here today, but for those of you who are less familiar, in very broad terms, a supported studio is a creative environment for individuals with specific health or social needs that encourages and supports different artistic practices. Supported studios facilitate professional development and career building opportunities individually or as a group or a collective. They promote artists in the marketplace and within galleries, develop networks and audiences beyond health and social care settings, and share a commitment to producing work of high artistic quality. And then thinking in their larger positionality, supported studios have often been framed primarily as structures of assistance. But in practice, they operate as cultural intermediaries. They support artists to develop practices over long periods of time. They build relationships with galleries, institutions, and curators. They are a resource not just for artists, but for the curators and the institutions. They advocate for artists' work to be recognized as contemporary art. And often they act as sustained advocates, navigating the ethical and practical questions that emerge as this visibility increases. But despite over half a century of practice, their impact on the British cultural landscape remains largely under-examined and under-recognized. And this notion of facilitation is often described quite simply, but in practice, it involves an extraordinary amount of relational labor. So we're interested in bringing some of that labor into view, not simply to acknowledge it, but to better understand how agency is sustained through it. Because much of this work remains invisible, and yet it is precisely what sustains artistic agency over time. And in this context, and in my research, agency is relational, meaning it's not something that someone simply has or hasn't, but is produced interdependently with others. And it makes me think of a conversation I had with Cheryl Cato, again, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, where she spoke of how, as a supported studio, ActionSpace cultivates the conditions of a relational space of creative agency for learning disabled artists who encounter restricted agency in so many other elements and domains of their daily life. And I think our task then, any of us who identify as cultural intermediaries, is to emulate and extend those conditions, to recognize advocacy not as an addition, but as embedded within that relational practice. That's coalitional thinking. So this just brings us back to two of the sort of methodological and practical awareness. Coalition is recognizing practices that are supported and facilitated and valuing that facilitation. We touched a little bit on that on the first panel discussion. So rather than fixed roles, this supports a coalitional working where autonomy is retained, but people come together for a shared purpose. This includes rethinking how cultural intermediaries work with artists, particularly those with less traditional modes of communication. Coalition recognizes the network of artists, facilitators, curators, institutions, and advocates who together shape how work is circulated and understood. It reminds us that artistic visibility is rarely produced by a single act, but emerges through networks of relationships. And as demonstrated through Nnena Kalu and ActionSpace, and particularly Nnena's relationship with Charlotte Hollinshead, that these relationships require trust, negotiation, and time. It asks us to recognize supported studios and their structures not as peripheral, but as the core actors, not as an add-on, but as co-architects within the cultural field. At the same time, practical awareness asks us to remain attentive of how these processes actually unfold in practice. Again, kind of asking these questions: who is involved and under what conditions? And how do the structures surrounding artistic work shape what becomes possible? And how might we shift our ways of working in active and reflexive ways? And for that, I was thinking of Roja of Arcadia Misa, and how as part of her initial process of working with Nnena in an artist-gallery relationship, she spent time volunteering at ActionSpace as a method for gaining knowledge about Nnena's practice. So those questions remain quietly present, again, under the conversations we're about to have. So introducing panel 2, Cultural Intermediaries, Facilitation, Coalition, and Advocacy. This panel asks from multiple perspectives what facilitation actually looks like in practice, and how we might better recognize supported studios and those working within them as cultural intermediaries in their own right, including the roles as advocates, shaping not just access to opportunities, but how artistic work is held, understood, and sustained. This panel focuses on the often unseen labor and decision-making that underpin facilitation and supported studio practice. We'll explore how agency, care, responsibility, and opportunity are negotiated as visibility increases, with a shared commitment that learning disabled artists are recognized as contemporary artists. Rather than focusing on history alone, this panel looks towards how these practices might shape a more coalitional future. This panel is a conversation about better understanding facilitation and support structures, about advocacy and agency, the labor and care that sustain artistic practices. While this panel is not an attempt to define best practice or to simplify the complexities of facilitation. Instead, we're interested in exploring the tensions, negotiations, and responsibilities that emerge in this work. So I'll now move on to introducing our panelists. We'll first hear from Charlotte Hollinshead, Head of Artistic Development at ActionSpace. Charlotte has worked at ActionSpace for over 30 years, and alongside this maintains her own participatory practice, developing and delivering inclusive projects. Specifically, Charlotte has worked with Nnena since 1999, supporting the development of a studio environment where Nnena has the agency to shape her creative practice on her own terms, while also navigating the opportunities and contexts in which the work is encountered. Charlotte brings extraordinary insight into studio relationships and care structures that sustain artistic practice over time. Then we'll hear from, Rosa Farkas, founder and director of Arcadia Misa, a gallery representing emerging and mid-career artists, including fellow 2025 Turner Prize nominee Rini Maddock and 2023 Turner Prize winning Jessie Darling. Arcadia Misa presented a solo exhibition of Nnena Kalu's work in 2024 and now represent her as a gallery artist. There's also a current drawing show of Nnena's work on at the moment as well. Rosa brings an important perspective on how gallery practice can engage with, support, and advocate for artists working within and beyond supported studio contexts. Next, we'll hear from Tom DiMaria, the director of Art Access for All, a nonprofit supporting the advancement of art practices for learning disabled individuals. Previously, Tom served as director of creative growth for 25 years in California, one of the most internationally recognized supported studios. From Judith Scott's retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum to the historic partnership with SF MoMA, Tom brings a significant perspective on institutional advocacy, long-term facilitation, and institutional networks. Then we'll hear from Gabrielle Morty, continuing the global perspective. Gabrielle is the co-founder and artistic director of Studio A in Sydney, Australia, a leading supported studio internationally. Gabrielle was awarded an Australia Council Award through which she undertook international research into the supported studio sector. She brings a perspective that connects local practice to broader international ecologies of supported studios, including how advocacy operates across different cultural and institutional contexts. So in terms of structure, similar to the first panel, each panelist will speak for around 15 minutes. We'll take a short break and then followed by a longer discussion. As before, as long as hopefully we can keep on time, so there is time for a long discussion. As before, we really encourage contributions from the audience during the discussion, as this is very much a shared space for thinking together. In closing, if the first panel explored how artistic practices are interpreted and encountered, this panel is looking more closely at the networks of labor, care, coalition, and what makes those encounters possible, and how those networks might better be recognized as part of the cultural work of the art world itself. So with that, I will introduce Charlotte. Thank you.